Am I here? Upcoming. It still says I'm not. No, it says that I'm streaming. I guess my website has not caught up yet. Okay. So let's see. Let's see. Is this. Open this up. Am I here? I am here. Okay, never mind. Okay, so we can start. I'm sorry about the delay. I was not sure what was going on. So, this is week 4 of Accelerate, and we are talking about measuring and changing culture within our organizations. And probably going to get through this pretty quick. What we talk about is we define organization style, cultural styles, and then we examine the bad kinds, and then we talk about the good kinds. So, and what else? And we just sort of unpack it. And this should actually be super quick. So, the first thing we want to talk about when we're measuring and changing corporate culture is we want to note right off the bat that it's possible to change company culture by implementing DevOps practices. And I think that this kind of talks about why that happens. And but before that, we want to talk about what are the components that make up an organizational culture. So we've got 3 levels of organizational culture. It starts with there are basic assumptions within a corporate culture. There are at the basic assumption things. These are things that you just kind of know. They're not necessarily written down anywhere. You might not even know how you know it, but they're just the assumptions, the things that you just know. And I wish I had taken some time to think about what a good example of that would be, but I mean, you typically might just know to show up at 9 and leave at 5, but maybe it's not written down. Anyways, so skip that. So the next thing, there are values. So basic assumptions, things you just know. Then there are values, and those are visible to the group members, and you might possibly debate them or discuss them. Something around how do we go about doing a code review or a just thing, or what is our philosophy on variable naming conventions, or how do we share information across teams? You might discuss how open you are with the other teams, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll bring up a chart later on. The final one is some of the most high level stuff, and these were the ones that we call artifacts. So we've got our basic assumptions, values, and then we have our artifacts. And our artifacts are like those inspiration posters that you see up on the wall, and they're mission statements, they're creeds, they're formal procedures. But they're maybe not always entirely accurate as well. So that's something to think about. Now, all of this comes together within the book. They take a moment and they talk about a social psychologist or a sociologist who defined, by the name of Westrom, who defined organizational archetypes. And that's, if you take all of the organizations in the world and you categorize the ways that they behave in general, you can come up with 3 clusters of types of organizations. And They range from pathological organizations, which are very power oriented. Then we've got bureaucratic organizations, where they are very rules oriented. And then finally, we have one called a generative organization, which is something that you would consider to be performance oriented. And so let's bring up, that's the first list right here. And if I look at that, so we've got our pathological organizations. Maybe they're characterized by fear and threat going on within, maybe you're worried about maybe you're worried about the future of your employment if you happen to work at some of these things, and they're very marked by a lot of political and Machiavellian intrigue, and information in these organizations is often hoarded, distorted, and withheld across teams and within teams because people are looking to cover their own ass. Really, they are afraid that if they let go of their power, they will lose their position within the hierarchy, and maybe they will eventually, if it's a fast firing culture marked by fear and dysfunction, then maybe you're going to worry about losing your job. So when things go wrong, people are saying, "Oh, give me a throat to choke," and that's pathological is one type of organization. The bureaucratic organization is one where departments are highly regimented and they work on a rules basis. Groups will defend their territory and they will push back. Often, even internal groups, they'll push back against another internal group trying to add something to their add workload to their group or responsibilities to their group, because they want to keep things in a, scalable or manageable fashion. They don't want to take on these extra responsibilities, and they're not always necessarily working towards the bottom line. And so finally, the third type of Westrum organization that we are really, these are the ones that we're trying to emulate and trying to move towards. They're ones where we focus on the mission. Okay, you act like professionals. Your primary concern is the performance of the business, and whether it's your team or their team or whoever gets the credit, whoever does the work, whoever takes this on, you're all moving together in the same direction, trying to come up with the working practices and to do things that make the company successful overall. So in the findings of the book or this Westrum fellow, they say that the culture of an organization predicts the flow of information. And so in these pathological and bureaucratic organizations, there may be blockers that prevent information from flowing from or prevent good information from moving around. So we move down and we look at something, and we'll talk about the characteristics of good information. What is good information? This is what we have in the generative organizations. So we've got good information provides answers to the questions that you have when you need it, and in a format you can consume. So things are perhaps written down in really easily readable points, and it's well organized with a hierarchy and taxonomy, so you can jump to exactly the part that you want, and there's not a lot of extraneous information, not a lot of cruft. So good information flow is critical to the safe operation of high tempo environments and high consequence environments. The culture of the organization, so culture predicts information flow. Information flow helps predict performance outcomes. Okay? And therefore, and through a number of other operations that we're going to see right on this table right here, culture of an organization predicts performance, right? So say that again. We've got information predicts performance, culture predicts information, and culture therefore predicts performance. So we've got we can look at some of the markers in this chart here. So we have, what's this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 axes. Six axes in a pathological, bureaucratic, or generative organization. We've got a cooperation axis, low, medium, high. What happens to somebody delivering bad news in a, messengers are ignored in the bureaucratic. They're shot or berated in the power-oriented and pathological organizations. And then trained, I should have taken better notes of this, but I think the training means, I actually don't know what that means. I'll have to look that up, and maybe I'll add some notes back to this later to make sure that I expand on that a little better. So who takes responsibilities in any given organizations, right? So in the power-oriented, or you try and throw other people under the bus, whereas in the bureaucratic organization, you carve out your piece and you do not touch you don't go outside your lines, you stay in your lane. Whereas in the generative organizations, again, very team-oriented cultures, people pull together, and it's less important who is ultimately responsible. Everybody is felt to be equally responsible for the success of the organization overall. Bridging is cross-departmental communication, I believe. So in power organizations, you don't go across departments, whereas in generative, you do. And so what happens, this is, again, we're talking about the bus driver. If failure leads to scapegoating, they throw somebody under the bus and trying to cover their own ass. Whereas failure in a generative organization really drives a deep dive into what went wrong. We talk about things like there is no root cause. We don't focus on human error. We focus on training conditions and things like that. Sorry, I'm just moving that back because I'm going into the red on the audio levels there. So, and then what happens when you show up with a good idea in a pathological? They say, "Get out of my face! I don't need this." Whereas in a generative organization, people really take the time to dive deep into valuable and new ideas. So we can drop out of that. You don't have to read along there. So the implications for high-performing organizations regarding culture, the culture, good culture and good culture at an organization is critical for enhancing the organizational performance based on people are more likely to work together. People are more likely to trust each other. They focus on the mission itself, and they depersonalize things that might go wrong between them. And they say that it actually encourages a more level playing field, where I think you can imagine. Anyways, so now one of the things that they take a moment to talk about here, again, just holding up the book because it happens to be right beside me. A note about bureaucracy is that it isn't necessarily bad on its own. And I find myself wondering in the reading itself if there are ways to have generative bureaucratic organizations where they're not necessarily bad on their own. You actually ensure that by following rules, you're playing fairly with all players in the in the company. The rules and systems and checklists are often designed by experts, and they represent the best form of accumulated knowledge on a subject within the organization. And so some of the things, like if we are talking about accelerate in terms of fully automated deployments, but in olden days, back when I started, having a go live checklist where things were still very manual. They weren't very highly scripted, but you would say, "Oh, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this," and you do everything in the right order, and you make sure that your go live process works appropriately. And so, also in project planning, you can use checklists to say, "We'll do these things, make sure we've done these things." But so a rule-oriented culture in the context there should be considered as problematic only when the rules themselves become more important than accomplishing the organizational goals. And so there are places where a business process or checklist or bureaucratic system can actually have some advantages within the organization. So next up, we go ahead and we talk about unpacking the impact of culture. So organizations with better information flow function more effectively. Good culture requires trust and cooperation. Good culture can indicate higher quality decision making with better information available. And so if you take a second to think about that, information is more broadly distributed. People on teams have more access to the underlying strategic goals, and then you can sort of use the wisdom of the crowd to source better solutions, because also in this less hierarchical, non-fear-based system, somebody with a good idea is willing to sort of be a hand raiser and say, well, what if we try this thing? What if we work on this a little bit? And so these organizations are more likely to be open and transparent. Problems are rapidly discovered and addressed. And it goes back to that same thing. If you are not afraid to raise your hand and say, I see a problem here, then you're more likely to raise your hand and say, I see a problem here. So we'll talk about this maybe next time or soon. Let me see. Is it here? It's not here. It's in a couple of weeks. We talk about how a lot of this stuff is based on Japanese auto manufacturing at Toyota, who really, in a historical context, became global pioneers in the ability for anybody within the organization, along the assembly line, to sort of pull a cord, stop the assembly line, and make a fix immediately. And it didn't matter who you were along the line, you all had that same ability to stop the presses, and really contribute to the bottom line of the organization, which is high performance. So that's about rapidly discovering and addressing problems. So culture, therefore, if we look at these three types of culture, pathological, bureaucratic, and generative, culture predicts the quality of the software delivery and overall organizational performance. Culture is super important. So what's also perhaps not surprising is a good culture also predicts higher levels of job satisfaction. So do you want to work in a place where you are afraid that your boss will yell at you, Or do you want to work in a place where if you come up with a good idea, the whole team will say, wow, we really appreciate that. Let's work on implementing the thing that you're saying. So there are lower levels of stress, higher levels of job satisfaction, lower levels of burnout, and it comes down to the fact that the people who are on your teams is actually less important than how the team members interact with each other. So it all comes down to team dynamics and in terms of culture. And culture matters quite a bit in predicting the quality and output of your product. So with all of that said above, everything we know, good culture is important. We want to have good culture. It's likely quite hard to change culture, but it is not impossible. And one of the things that you can do there's a great, highly recommended book called Turn the Ship. Well, one of the things you can do to turn the ship is don't bother changing how people think. Change how they behave. So when you start adapting and adopting lean and agile methodologies, that can have an effect on your culture. And so these people don't have to, your teammates or people at your companies don't have to believe in the process that they're doing. They can fake it until they make it. And so you can act your way towards a better culture by acting like somebody who's in a generative culture without actually believing that all of this stuff is important. And so we talk later on in later chapters, we talk about lean management. We've talked a little bit about continuous delivery. I'm sure it comes back up, but that is this week. And so that's it. Culture matters. And if you want a high performing organization, focus on culture.